Roger Nygard back here on the Hollywood Editing Mentor podcast, this time with a brand new book called The Documentarian, The Way to a Successful and Creative Professional Life in the Documentary Business. Roger, it's great to see you again, my friend. How you doing?
Doing good. Yeah, I'm glad to be a veteran of your show. Thanks for having me back.
Not a lot of people can say that. So, but always great to have you here and chat with you, and really excited to talk about this new book. And honestly, before I just get to my questions, I have a lot. Just kind of briefly tell us what this book is about and just what led you to writing it.
Well, last time I was here, we talked about editing, obviously, because I'd written a book about editing called Cut to the Monkey. And it was about comedy and editing, and I felt like I had some ideas, thoughts, techniques, things that I wanted to share with other editors. So I wrote that book. And after I finished that book, I thought, you know what? I've got another area of expertise, making documentaries. And I thought, I want to do the same thing. So what I did with the first book and what I also did with this book is I approached them both like a documentarian. I talked to other editors in Cut to the Monkey. And in this book, I talked to other documentary filmmakers and interviewed them about their tips and tricks and the secrets they use and how do they craft a story, how do they find their stories, how does this all work in editing, and how inextricably linked editing is to the creation of a documentary and storytelling and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I gathered all their wisdom along with the things I learned making my documentaries to try to make here's how you do it, people. Here's how the experts do it. This will save you a lot of time and trouble. And let me jump ahead. Let me just say this right off the bat. The number one mistake people make, and I really wanted to get this out there in the book because I see this again and again. People come to me and say, I've got this idea for a documentary, blah, blah. And so I always ask them, okay, that's a great idea. What is your theme? And they go, what? What's a theme? Well, if you don't know your theme, it's like you don't have a guidepost. You don't know where you're headed. What is the documentary about on a thematic, a basic level? Like, what is the moral of the story? A theme, an example of a theme is absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's a theme. And so let's say your documentary is about someone who abuses power. Well, then you need to, what I would do, write your theme down on a piece of paper and post it above your computer while you're editing. So and then every time you're crafting a scene or using pieces, ask yourself, does this piece, this segment, this chapter I'm using in my documentary, does it relate to this theme somehow? Because if it doesn't, it probably doesn't belong in your documentary. And that helps people sharpen their focus on just what are we making here. Many times documentaries are not captivating because they don't have that central premise, that core in a concept documentary versus a narrative documentary. Both of them generally have a 3-act structure, just like a scripted movie, a narrative feature. But a concept documentary is unified by that theme, a core question that you ask at the beginning. One of my documentaries is called The Nature of Existence. And my core question was, why do we exist? So the whole movie is about that one question, which I'm promising implicitly at the beginning of the documentary by asking it, that I will answer this question by the end of the film. And that's what holds audiences to the end. Or a film like Food, Inc. asks a core question of why is corporate farming so unhealthy for human beings? Now we're going to go and investigate this and give you answers. And by the end of the documentary, you'll be satisfied that you've learned the answer to that question. So that's why I wrote the book, because I felt like I've got to get this message out to people who are struggling with their documentary projects.
Look, first of all, I'm guilty of that. I made that mistake a couple of years ago when I not only edited a documentary, but I was part of creating it. And that was the thing. I wish I would have had your book, honestly, back then, because this just lays it out. Like you said, it gives practical advice, not just for yourself, but other experts. It tells you how to do it, which I totally love.
I try to make it very much of a how-to manual. The first 2/3 of the book is exactly that. And then the last third of the book is a case study where I took my first film, TREKKIES, and I showed the behind the scenes of how we sold that film. Because if you're making a documentary and you think you get to the finish line, we finished, got a final cut, and it's screening now at a film festival, and I'm all done, a distributor is going to pick it up and run away with it, and I don't have to do anything else. You're at the halfway point once you get to a final cut. You're not done. You may spend more money than you made making the film. trying to get it seen, released, publicized. You typically have to do is when you're making your budget for a film, here's what I'm going to spend making the film, and here's an equal amount I'm going to spend trying to release the film. You have to keep both of those in mind.
Well, also the other part is, at least for me, like me personally, what I really loved about this book as well is that part at the end, right? When you're like, well, now what do I do, right? Like, I want to get this, find distribution. I want to make money off of this, right? I mean, like, that's valid. And I literally was having this conversation again this weekend. It's like, well, how do you get this scene, right? I was talking to someone and like, they're asking, how do you get this scene? How do you put it like on a stream or this and that? And so again, that's something that I appreciate about this book is that you go through that process.
There is a technique to selling your film, and it's a very different skill set from making and editing a film. But as a filmmaker, if it's your film, you need to have both of those skill sets, or you team up with a producer who has that skill set. Or what many filmmakers do, and I've done this, is once the film is done, you find a film agent, a film rep, who takes you under his wing or her wing and helps you sell the film. But even in that case, you still have to do the work. You can't just hand it off to someone because nobody is as motivated as you are to sell your film. So you keep selling it. You'll spend a year. Very typically, I mean, I've spent 4 years making a film and then a year on the film festival circuit and looking for a film rep and or distribution. And then once I have that, a year publicizing the film after or during its release. So it's a very long process and you need to be ready for each of these stages. And I tried to lay out, here's how you do each one of these jobs.
Let's talk about more, I guess, editing and shooting. I mean, I also, the thing is that when you watch a documentary, I mean, like to get good interviews, I mean, like and just make it great. I mean, there's a lot of work details that go into creating this. And I also again, I love a lot of things I love about your book, but that you talk about just, what cameras to choose, what lenses, how to approach a documentary. I mean, an interview. I mean, like the little details, right? That just make something, in this case, documentary or interview, great.
I spent a whole chapter on interviewing, and the primary lesson for interviewers, if you take away one thing today, if you're going to do an interview, a documentary interview or a podcast interview, any kind of interview, you want to ask your question and then shut up. Wait. Let the subject fill that awkward space. Don't you, as the interviewer, rush in to try to fill it, which is going to be your natural inclination. Override that inclination. Ask the question and then shut up and wait. That's when you get the good stuff, because you have to think as an editor also while you're interviewing. Think about when you're in the editing room. I've seen interviews where the person doing the interview keeps talking over the subject or saying, yeah, oh, all these things that contaminate both tracks. So say your question and not a multi-part question. Ask a single direct question and then wait. If you ask a multi-part question, you're probably only going to get the answer to the second part of the question. And never ask a yes or no question. Do you like being a doctor? Yes. Everything comes to a stop, right? You want to ask the type of question that encourages elaboration. So instead of saying, do you like to be being a doctor, say, talk about how you feel working in the ER. Now they're going to ramble on and tell you about their feelings about their job, which is so much richer than the more academic. What's it like being a doctor? Well, I come to work and then I talk to people. No, how do you feel interacting with your patients? Talk about this, talk about that. That's how you get much richer content from an interview subject.
Like asking the right question, that's an art in itself. I mean, how can someone just, I guess, get better at asking the right questions, or how do you find those right questions to ask?
Well, first is practice. You get better with practice, obviously. But before you get there, you want to think it through, write your questions down, type up your document with your questions, and then make them concise. Go through and revise them, make them as short and concise and direct as possible without, if possible, without injecting your own bias. Try to ask the question that will get the answers you want. Sometimes when I interview somebody, there's a very specific sentence I'm looking for because I've read their book and I want them to regurgitate what I already know they have, because I know I need this link in my film between A and C. I know they've got B in their mouth because I read it in their book. And when I ask the question, sometimes they'll give me a very long-winded version that I can't use, or they could have just done it better. So often I'll say, that was great. This is very important, and I want to go through it one more time and see if we can get a little more concisely. So you guide them, you direct them, and tell them what you want. They like that. They want to look good. They want you to help them look good. And so then we'll do it again. I'll ask the question, tell me, how does it feel being a doctor? And then when I get that answer I want, or if it's close, I might even go a third time and say, that was much better. Thank you. Awesome. Could you try saying this sentence like this? And I'll just feed them the line. Say this, and suggest, could you just say, when I was 22 years old in medical school, I had this class where I worked on cadavers. Maybe that's the sentence I want. I'll give it to them and ask them to, and I already know that it's an accurate statement, but I'm thinking as an editor, while I'm doing the interview, I want short, concise sound bites, not something I have to try to repatch together and use cutaways to try to make it work, which oftentimes you'll have to do. So it's a pleasure when you've got somebody who's a soundbite machine or who's very good at pulling their sentences together. But you can help them do that and have them restate something, go through it 2 or 3 times if you have to. Werner Herzog told me at a Q&A once after a film, I was watching one of his films, and I asked him questions afterward. He asked one of his subjects to go through the same story 3 or 4 times, and each time it was like 45 minutes long. But he finally got the version he wanted. And he also said this is a great tip from Werner Herzog, which I've never forgotten. He said he was at a film festival once, and a filmmaker came up to him and said, I've been shooting this film. I've got 700 hours of footage, and I don't know what to do with it. And he said his heart just went out to this poor guy. And he said to the guy, shoot what you really want for the screen. We're filmmakers, not garbage collectors. That's why you want to know what you want. You go in there, because you've got a theme, you've got a story structure in mind, you've got an ending. Hopefully you know where you're headed. That's what I also tell editors and documentary filmmakers. If you're confused about what you've got, what's your ending? Work backwards from that. Everything should lead up to that and support an arc that's leading to that ending. Maybe you're lucky and it's easy because it's a true crime story. So there's a verdict, or do the police catch the person? Or in a quest documentary, like Searching for Sugar Man, what happened? Do they find the guy? Or maybe it's a journey of self-discovery. It's about the filmmaker himself or herself. And so they're going to learn this lesson by the end of the film, like Super Size Me. He's going to learn, does this eating junk food for 30 days, what does it do to his body? So it helps to have an ending. When I interviewed Davis Guggenheim, he made a film called Waiting for Superman. He had first been asked by the production company, hey, can you make a film about education? And he said, no, it's just a concept. It's not, I don't know. I can't. No, he passed. And then he thought about it, and he happened to read about this place, I think it's called the Seed School, where they would have a lottery and let in underprivileged students, a certain amount, if your number came up on this bingo ball. And he thought, okay, now I've got an ending. If your number comes up, you're a winner. And so he followed all these students up to that bingo lottery point, and he would see whose life would be changed dramatically by their number coming up and who would have to find another answer. So there's another way to figure out your story. Work backwards.
Now, this is an editing podcast. Let's talk about editing a documentary. From your own experience, and hearing other people talk about it, any tips or what can people learn from your book about editing a documentary? Obviously you have a ton of footage. You're trying to find the story probably as you go along or as you're shooting. But how do you personally approach, again, a huge amounts of footage and say, trying to find the path to take with regards to the story?
Well, the editor is often the writer of the film. Sometimes the editor works with the director, or there's a separate writer. And the writing credit is sometimes not even used, because you think of a writer as someone who writes a screenplay. But probably most of your favorite documentaries were very carefully written by somebody, whether it's in the editing room or with an outline beforehand, which is then elaborated upon in the editing room. When I took the job editing the docuseries The Comedy Store, Mike Binder had outlines for his episodes. That was a good beginning point. I took that and basically rewrote all of them in the editing room in a way to try to give them more structure. Also, I worked with Mike to give each episode its own theme, which he hadn't really infused them with yet. And that helped me as an editor, deciding what goes in each episode. And as the writer, sometimes I'm writing, if there's a host or a narrator, then you're going to write the voiceover. And if there isn't, then I'm looking for the people to tell the story in one piece after another. So I'm putting like with like. So that's one great editing technique I found, is just start grouping. If you don't know where to begin, just start putting like with like. And you're creating little nuggets and chunks that then maybe will become part of a segment. And then you can move those segments around within a chapter or an act. And pretty soon you've got a flow. You can put them on note cards. And this is very common. You write down the idea for each of these nuggets or segments on a note card, put them on the wall or lay them on the floor and move them around until you can find an order. It helps to think visually, as like seeing it somewhere where you can move it around with your hands. That helps, as opposed to just trying to figure it all out in your computer. That's another great trick for figuring out your story. Then I think about pacing. And what is pacing? Pacing is basically deciding when to reveal the next plot point, and probably much sooner than you already are. Bring it in quickly. You never want the audience to be able to guess what's next, but you also don't want to go so fast that you lose them. They lose track. So that's the dance you as the editor are following. Typically, though, I opt for faster pacing. Particularly today, audiences' attention spans are much faster than they were 40 years ago, because things have just sped up. We're used to it with taking things in smaller bites. But then when you do slow down for a moment, that itself becomes an emphasis. So I am a curator of the pause as its own emphasis by speeding up the pacing. Then I think about music. Now, should you edit with music? I never edit with music. I add music later, because I think music should amplify the emotion that's already within a scene. And if I use the music first, it tends to cover up the problems. It's like a Band-Aid, and then I might miss things. So I try to make the best edit I can without music, then add music to improve it. Ken Burns does the opposite. So you can do it both ways. He will record the music and get it just the way he likes it, and then edit to the music for his documentaries. So there's no wrong way. You can ignore all the suggestions I'm giving you and find a better way that works for you. But it helps to understand these things before you violate some of the common rules.
Yeah, no, Roger, I agree. I think, I'm all about breaking rules, but of course it's important to first understand them, why they exist. I think I'm all about the fundamentals, right? And there's no set way of doing things, right? Everyone has their own way of telling a story and whatnot. You got to find what works best for you. But I think here in this book, you lay out that foundation, right? To start there, right? And then figure out maybe, the way you personally like to do things.
My very first film, TREKKIES, as I was making it, I realized I was violating all the rules. I didn't know the rules yet. I had not studied making documentaries. I was learning by doing. And as I was making TREKKIES, the thing I realized is that it had no central story. There was no main protagonist with a goal of any kind. And the most successful documentaries have that. So how do you make a successful film without without the blueprint that generally helps ensure? It's great insurance for a successful film. I was figuring that out as I went along. And so the solution that I used at the time was I told a series of short stories. Each chapter was about a new character. We would introduce Gabriel Kerner or Barbara Adams, the Whitewater juror. You'll meet her and what was the big thing, that the conflict in her life. And so you knew as a viewer, even if you weren't as enamored of this one character, you got the sense there'd be another one very soon. And I think part of the reason that the film was so successful, and it ended up being a grand slam, I mean, it bought my house, it was so successful for us financially, is because two more reasons, maybe three. It was timely. No one had ever done a fan documentary before, so we were the first. We had a core audience of people who were going to be interested in the film no matter what, in Star Trek fans, which is a great thing to have when you're starting out. And number three, it was really funny. And people might not have been expecting to see a film about Star Trek fans and find out it's hilarious, but audiences love to be surprised. So because we had those elements, I think those helped contribute to our success, but you'll have a much better chance if you have a strong story.
Yeah, definitely go check out TREKKIES, all our listeners. Besides, obviously, TREKKIES, any, I guess, other documentaries that you recommend that feature maybe different styles of storytelling?
When I was in film school, Frederick Wiseman was a filmmaker that was brought up. He sort of, you can't say he invented cinema verite, but he was the one who brought it to the forefront with his film Titicut Follies. If you've never seen Titicut Follies, you should probably put that on your watch list because it was so influential, and it was banned at the time when it came out. For about 30 or 40 years, you could not see it unless you were using it for teaching purposes or legal purposes. That was the ban that he ended up, that when he went to court to fight this banning of his film, that was the compromise that the court came up with. Now you can see it. It's no longer banned. But he went into a mental institution and just filmed what was going on there. And it was so shocking to people at the time how inmates at this institution were treated. That's why it was so controversial. But he did not ask any questions. He just was a fly on the wall, filming what was happening. And then he went back and crafted a documentary out of those pieces in the editing room. And the way he found his ending for that film is he took something he shot early, which was an inmate talent show, and put that at the end, which gave him sort of a finale. Here are all the inmates you've met, you've come to learn about performing in a talent show. And that gave a sense of a completion to his story. So that's one style. If you're wrestling with where's my story in a cinema verite style, you may look for something that you shot. You might find your ending earlier. You might not know what your ending is until you get to the editing room. I shot a film called 6 Days in Roswell about UFO fanatics in Roswell, New Mexico, during a celebration they have every July 4th weekend. They celebrate the crash of this alleged UFO in Roswell, New Mexico. We filmed there at the 50th anniversary, and I edited together all the footage and found all of the missing, there are holes. We were missing things. We need a link from here to there. It'd be nice to have this. And we don't really have an ending. When I was forearmed with what was missing, we went back the next year and filmed at the 51st anniversary also, and got all the pieces we needed and combined them back into the documentary, which we present as not a 2-year chronicle, but a 1-year chronicle. The first year we were there with all the holes patched, thanks to our revisit. So we did a reshoot to find the pieces we needed, which were not apparent until the editing room, until the editing process. So that's another way to do it. And we used some reenactments. We were never bashful about telling people this is what we want to sort of reenact this moment. We'd go back and get something that we missed the first time. And Errol Morris is probably the one who brought reenactments into documentary filmmaking with his film, The Thin Blue Line. And in film school, that's another film that they'll probably force you to watch, or if they didn't, you should see it, where he rejects the idea of cinema verite, that you should be hands-off. He's very hands-on. He uses slow motion, and he uses look-alike actors to restage events that happened in the past to show the audience it could have happened this way from this angle, or it could have happened that way from another angle. And his film led to the release of Randall Dale Adams, who was on death row. His film helped prove this guy innocent by showing that what he was convicted of could probably never have happened. And so you have all these tools at your disposal as a filmmaker when you're shooting. And then when you get to the editing room, am I going to use reenactments? Am I going to maybe you use animation? That's very popular now to fill those holes where there's no way to film something or it's happened in the past. And I did this in my latest documentary, The Truth About Marriage. I hired 4 different animators and gave them all different segments, and I used different styles of animation to fill these spots. Or for example, I wanted to show sperm competition, like when sperm is chasing an egg, because this evolutionary biologist, Robin Baker, was talking about sperm competition. He wrote a book called Sperm Wars, and I interviewed him about how human relationships, courtship on a macro level mirrors what happens at the micro level between the sperm and the egg. How men tend to court women and how the sperm tends to chase the egg are very similar in many ways. Choose me, choose me. And I had no way to show that except the animator. And his animations were very funny, showing these sperm like in boot camp, trying to get stronger so they can win the race. And it made a funny moment while also showed the idea, the concept that was being talked about, and it gave me a cutaway so I don't have to just sit on a talking head. That's your other challenge. You don't want to just string together a bunch of talking heads one after another. Obviously, that's going to start to get tedious. So you get cutaways. Hopefully, while you're filming, you're thinking like an editor, and you're shooting inserts of things in the room or the person, or wringing their hands if they're nervous, or holding a pencil, close up, wide shot, multiple cameras, right? You want to be closer, and then a medium, maybe a third camera on a wider shot. That gives you the ability to intercut and take out the pauses and to take out the unnecessary phrases. You also want to shoot what's called a portrait shot, which is your subject just sitting there, waiting, not speaking at all. So you can use that maybe when you're introducing them. Or you do what they do on 60 Minutes all the time. Get a shot of your subject just walking along somewhere or doing their thing. Maybe they live at home, cooking at home in their natural environment, which is a good place to interview people also. Interview them in their natural environment, doing their thing, preparing lunch for their children, or driving somewhere, or cleaning up the garage, whatever is natural, as opposed to just sitting in a chair static. Look for dynamic ways to film, look for cutaways, maybe get shots of the newspaper headlines that they've got in their scrapbook, or go through the photographs they have and get shots of those, or the books on their shelf, or if it's an author, a shot of his or her books. Think about as many possibilities to cut to during the dialogue, and you'll miss a lot of them. So you go back later and you get them, buy their book and shoot an insert of it, or maybe contact them and try to get some photographs. Best if you can get it all while you're there. Going back afterwards is much harder, chasing them afterward. And also, very important, get the release form signed before the interview, before it starts, so that they don't get cold feet and refuse to sign afterward. We had to chase George Takei for months after our interview in TREKKIES because he refused to sign the release form on the day of the interview. Denise Crosby finally persuaded him to sign it a few months later, which is, obviously it was great. We could use him in the film. But most of the time, everybody, if you put a release form in front of somebody, they just sign it. Maybe 2 or 3 times out of hundreds has someone actually read the release form in front of me. And that's fine. And if there's something they object to, you can agree to, okay, we can take that out. That's not relevant to what I need for this interview. Draw a line through it, and you both initial it, and you still got what you need. So those are very important things to think about that will affect your editing process. You want the tools, you want all those pieces, you want those cutaways so you can make it dynamic and pick up the pacing.
That's an excellent tip, and honestly, something probably that a lot of people don't think about, but I totally get it about the release form and other great tips there, Roger. And of course, our listeners, you have there now a couple of projects to watch. Definitely check them out. I do want to, before we wrap things up, I do want to ask you another thing, and I want to ask you about funding, because that's also something that comes up a lot when I talk about documentaries with people trying to create them. It's like, oh, where do I get money for this? You know, maybe give us some insight about with regards to that.
It was Frederick Weissman again who told me that his advice to filmmakers is to get your funding for your films, marry rich.
There you go.
That's your best way. Or know some rich people and then ask them for their money. They don't need it all. And what better way to invest than in your exciting project? Tell them how exciting this process is going to be. What sells people is enthusiasm. Your enthusiasm for this project is going to be infectious. So once you've got a pitch, which you've narrowed down, you've got your story, you're obsessed with it yourself, you're really into it, you're enthusiastic, then you approach every person you know with money, from your dentist relative to your parents to any rich person who you have access to, or you can get on the phone, or of course, production companies, streamers. Generally, if you're going to pitch to networks or streamers, you've already got a production company on board or an agent on board, and they will set up the pitch meetings, usually all around the same time or within a short period of time, a couple of weeks. So you hit everybody at once because you want multiple interest. You'll get the best deal when you have multiple companies interested. And if you have a good idea, a good pitch, they're hungry for them. They're looking for them. The difficulty is access. How do you get the access? And it's difficult if you don't have a track record, because track record is what gets you in the door, or the track record of your agent or the production company that you've hooked up with. So you might have to shoot a sizzle reel, a demo, go interview somebody who's involved in whatever the topic is that you're excited about, and cut together a short 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute version of your documentary. Add some cutaways, steal things from YouTube, borrow clips from movies, and make it shine, give it music, make it exciting, and make sure that it presents your theme, your core question. The whole point of the documentary is there. So when someone watches your sizzle reel, they go, wow, this is a great idea. I want to be involved. And that's the seed you need to get people to join your crusade, and hopefully to write you a check. And then if you do get investors, I mean, the ideal thing is a single investor. If you've got multiple people to answer to, it gets more complicated because they all have opinions, but you get what you can get. And once you've got your investors lined up, you need a framework to accept their money, which means you probably have to create a company, maybe an LLC or an S Corp, or like with TREKKIES, we created a partnership, which is a legal format, which requires a document that says what everyone who's in the partnership, what their role is, what their salary is, what their ownership is. For an LLC, you have an agreement also. For a corporation, you have an agreement that outlines everyone's participation. And then you'll need that to go to the bank to open an account, a business account. You open the account, and then you can deposit the investor's money into the name of the business that you've created that will now own this film. Ideally, you're the only owner. It's best when you're the owner and people chase you for their share of the profits, as opposed to someone else owning the film and you have to chase them to get your share of the profits. Try never to give away points. Ownership. Try to remain the owner and have investors who are not able to tell you what to do. They can give, I guess what you give them is consultation as opposed to any veto rights. It's really going to depend on what you negotiate with people, but negotiate for yourself so you are the owner with the final say, the final cut, and they are silent or passive investors. That's the ideal situation.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's important to know how to protect yourself. And also, like you said, look, you got to be excited about this stuff. And if you are, people will notice it and will, very likely want to participate and join you on this journey. Roger, obviously we have a lot of listeners want to work in documentaries, whether it be, just as, editing documentaries or maybe even creating them, but any advice for our listeners that want to get into, the documentary space?
Yeah, shoot a short documentary and then show that to people. That's what will get you the job. You might luck into getting someone hiring you to, let's say you've never edited a documentary before. You could get lucky, but the best way to get that job is you can say, hey, look at this short film or look at this thing I edited. And they'll look at that, and if it makes them excited, then there'll be a better chance that they'll hire you. So go out and shoot something that will give you skills beyond just editing, which will improve your editing because you went out and you did the interview and you collected the footage and you brought it all together into a project and output a final product that shines, that shows what you can do. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be long. It just has to be polished and captivating. It could be about your grandmother. Go shoot a quick documentary about your grandmother and some event that she has told you about her whole life and that is a good story that happened to her or your grandfather or somebody, your neighbor. I guarantee somebody with an amazing story somewhere in your life. Have them tell it to you, gather the photographs, scan them in, and make a short documentary that shows that you have a grasp of the techniques.
Well, I love that. I just, I agree with you. And it's the thing, it's like, well, first of all, yeah, look, right now, nowadays, it's just it's easier, right, to go out there and shoot something. Literally with your iPhone, there's a mirrorless camera. We have free editing software now, right? It's just much more easier to go out there and shoot something. And also, yeah, I agree. You know what? A lot of great stories out there. I think I encourage people to just be out and experience life and talk to people, hear the stories, really listen, right? Just don't, I know like a lot of us just are stuck kind of inside our homes, and it's like, get out there, like live a life, experience it. You will find a wealth of interesting stories.
That's why I have a map of the world behind me, behind my editing system. While I'm editing, I'm looking at that map going, where do I want to travel next when I finish this job? And I always do. I go somewhere new.
Well, I've seen where you're traveling. I love seeing your photos.
And bring your camera, bring your documentary camera, meet people and make a film about your trip. And then it becomes a business expense.
There's that as well. Roger, honestly, right now, I want to go make a documentary, honestly. Thank you for being here on the show. Everyone, go get Roger's book, The Documentarian, The Way to a Successful and Creative Professional Life in the Documentary Business, or also get Cut to the Monkey. That's also another great book. Are you any plans for a third one?
Yeah, it's like somebody stop me before I write again. I love that process, and I work on it in between editing jobs. Last year it was Curb Your Enthusiasm. This year it's a series for Netflix called The Residents. And on weekends or in between jobs, I find myself writing or journaling. And I would highly recommend that editors also keep a journal of your industry experience or your daily thoughts, whatever. I was able to write the last 4 chapters of the book about the selling of Trekkies because I kept a journal at the time. I wrote down everything that happened, everything everybody said, and I would have never remembered all these things with such accuracy if I didn't write them down at the time, and I didn't know at the time what I would ever use it for. But it, decades later, came in so handy. I was able to show people exactly what happened, and there's a psychology behind selling a film. It took us 6 months from our first distributor screening until we sold the film. I mean, some people win the lottery and sell their film overnight at Sundance, but that's less than 1% of the films, probably less than 1% of 1% of the films. Most likely it's going to be a long process where you've got to be persistent and obsessive and never give up. And you can see how that happened with us. Even with a film that sold for a record amount of money at the time, it was not easy. And so because I kept records and I wrote down the dialogue, not ever knowing what I would do, I was just banking it. I just kept it. You should do the same. You should keep track of what your daily life is like in a journal, or whenever you think about it. But even if you skip it for a week or two, you forget about it, come back to it every once in a while. And especially if you've had an interesting experience, like you had a job interview or you worked on a show with a great showrunner and you had a funny exchange. I mean, I kept track of a lot of my funny exchanges with Larry David, as you could imagine. And I'm so glad they're just jewels that I have and I use many of them in Cut to the Monkey as a result. So be creative in other ways other than just editing. Express yourself creatively, and it helps all your talents to diversify.
Oh man, I love that, Roger. Definitely agree with you. It's just always, again, I encourage people the same. Stay creative. Don't get locked into just here the computer and Avid or Premiere, whatever. Go out.
Because you're an editor. An editor is a writer. Editors are writers. So you should be writing as well as editing if you want to unlock the fullest ability.
Roger, again, thank you for being here on the show. Always great to see you, my friend. And again, everyone, go get Roger's books. I'm gonna say books, plural.
Yeah, and all my films are on Amazon and wherever you rent your movies. You can see my documentaries as well.
Awesome, Roger. Thanks again for being on the show.
It's a pleasure. I'm so glad you had me back.